At 30,000 feet above the earth, a silence hung heavy inside the crowded airplane. What had started as a routine flight soon twisted into a nightmare for one young woman who never imagined she would be singled out, humiliated, and left, defenseless in front of strangers. The aisle felt like a stage, and she was forced into the spotlight of cruelty, her dignity stripped away by the harsh sting of harassment. Whispers turned into insults, stares into judgmental daggers, until it seemed every pair of eyes bore down on her with either scorn or cowardly silence. She tried to shrink into herself, clutching her armrest as though it could protect her, but the storm only grew louder, uglier, more merciless. No flight attendant intervened. No fellow passenger dared to rise. The higher the plane soared, the deeper she fell into a pit of fear, shame, and hopelessness. She was utterly alone. Or so she thought. From the back of the cabin, a presence rose. His steps were slow but unwavering, cutting through the suffocating air of prejudice. Towering, composed, his gaze carried both the weight of suffering endured and the strength of resilience won. No one knew yet who he was, or the unimaginable power he carried beyond his tailored suit and calm authority. But in that moment, he was not just another passenger. He was the reckoning the cruelty never saw coming. This was the instant everything would change. The story began long before the cabin lights dimmed and turbulence shook the air. It began with two very different lives, shaped by different worlds, now set on a collision course thousands of feet above the ground. She was named Claire Whitmore, a woman who grew up surrounded by comfort, yet never felt at home in her own skin. Her life was polished, carefully presented, the kind admired on the surface yet hollow when examined closely. Raised in the quiet suburbs of Connecticut, her family clung to appearances the way drowning hands cling to driftwood. Her father, a man of rigid values and whispered prejudices, demanded perfection. Her mother, fragile and distant, played the part of elegance while hiding her own fractures behind pearls and practiced smiles. Claire, though delicate in appearance, carried a stubborn heart that beat to a rhythm neither her family nor her community understood. She sought freedom in small rebellions, books hidden under blankets, late-night runs through the streets, dreams of travel that carried her beyond the neat fences of her neighborhood. Yet she had been taught all her life that her worth was not her own to define. Her body, her choices, her very identity were pieces of a reputation her family managed like currency. Every step outside their expectation was a wound inflicted on their pride. She longed to escape. And so she boarded that flight, thinking it would be another ordinary trip, never knowing it would place her on the path of someone who would change everything. Miles away, in a very different childhood, Michael Adebayo had risen from struggles that most could scarcely imagine. Born in Atlanta to Nigerian immigrants, his earliest years were shaped by sacrifice. His parents worked endless shifts, hands blistered, backs aching, while instilling in their son the values of discipline and perseverance. He learned the rhythm of survival, the balance of humility with ambition. He watched the world measure, him by the color of his skin before it measured his mind or his will. Yet Michael refused to be caged by prejudice. Every rejection became fuel, every insult a silent vow. He studied relentlessly, pushed himself beyond exhaustion, and carved a path into elite universities where his presence was a statement in itself. With brilliance and an unyielding spirit, he broke into industries that had long closed their doors. To men who looked like him, years of resilience built an empire, transforming him into more than a wealthy man, into a billionaire whose very success was an act of defiance against a system designed to keep him small. But wealth did not shield him from the shadow of racism. In boardrooms, he was underestimated. In public, he was watched. At every level, he remained a target for those who could not see past skin. He carried these battles like invisible scars, hidden beneath the fabric of bespoke suits and the polished mask of calm. To many, he was a symbol of triumph. To himself, he was simply a man who had learned to survive a world that never stopped testing him. Their lives were destined to cross in a place where neither expected it, inside a plane that symbolized both freedom and entrapment. Claire, searching for a sliver of independence. Michael, weary of constant battles, craving a moment of anonymity. The cabin that carried them both through the skies would become a crucible of prejudice, pain, and unexpected courage. As the flight took off, both carried their private thoughts. Claire pressed her forehead to the window, the glow of the horizon reminding her there were bigger worlds waiting beyond her sheltered life. Michael sat further back, quietly scanning business reports on his tablet, though his eyes often lifted, to study the people around him with the intuition of a man who had been judged one too many times. Neither spoke, neither noticed the other, yet. But the stage had already been set. The ordinary minutes of the flight ticked away, carrying them closer to the moment where everything would shatter. Because sometimes destiny doesn't arrive with a warning. It arrives mid-flight, in a storm of cruelty, when the silence of bystanders cuts deeper than the words of aggressors. It arrives when one person dares to rise while everyone else remains seated, and before the wheels of that plane would touch the ground, Claire's sheltered world and Michael's battle-hardened existence would collide in a way that neither could forget. The flight settled into its rhythm. The hum of engines filled the cabin, passengers adjusted pillows, flipped through magazines, or tapped away on glowing screens. Yet beneath this ordinary quiet, threads of unease were already weaving together, unseen by most. Claire shifted in her seat, trying to lose herself in a book, but the stares had already begun. At first they seemed harmless, just glances from across the aisle, quick and dismissive. She had always noticed how people looked at her when she traveled alone. Some with curiosity, some with suspicion. But this time there was something sharper in those eyes, something that crawled across her skin and left her uneasy. It began with whispers. 2 rows ahead, voices carried in low tones, muttering words that seemed casual at first, but when repeated, grew jagged. She caught fragments. Spoiled, out of place, thinks she's better. They weren't directed at her by name, but their eyes, their pointed looks, left no doubt. She sank deeper into her seat, hoping to disappear. When the turbulence struck, the cabin shuddered and laughter rippled from the same row. The laughter was not from humor, but cruelty sharpened by the thrill of someone else's discomfort. Claire gripped her armrest tightly, cheeks warming as the whispers grew bolder. Now the words were clear, no longer masked by politeness. Entitled. Little princess. Probably one of those who think they own everything. The tone wasn't just mocking, it was laced with venom that seemed to hunger for her humiliation. And then the shift came. A phrase, spat out carelessly but heavy, enough to suffocate her. Typical white girl. The insult wasn't just personal, it was racial. It carried an edge of contempt that reached deeper than the surface. Claire froze. She had been insulted before, even bullied. But this was different. It wasn't about her as a person any more, but about the color of her skin, about something she had no control over, something twisted into a weapon against her. The passengers around her did nothing. Some pretended to sleep. Some turned their heads to the windows. A few chuckled quietly, their silence becoming complicity. Claire's chest tightened as if the air itself had turned heavy. The isolation was worse than the insults. She was surrounded by dozens, yet utterly abandoned, Michael noticed. From his seat at the back, his eyes lifted from his tablet and narrowed toward the voices. He had heard this before, too many times, too many places. Prejudice wasn't new to him. It followed like a shadow. But what struck him wasn't just the words. It was the silence that followed them. The way an entire cabin chose cowardice over decency. It was the same silence he had lived through countless times, the same silence that allowed cruelty to thrive. As the minutes dragged on, the harassment escalated. A man in the aisle seat leaned back, muttering louder now so all could hear. Figures. Sitting there all smug, privileged, never had to fight for anything. His companions snickered, emboldened. The insults became a rhythm, each one cutting deeper. Little princess? Pathetic. Out of place. And again, the sharp, ugly repetition. Typical white girl. Claire's hands trembled in her lap. She wanted to speak, to defend herself, but her voice seemed locked in her throat. If she spoke, would they stop? Or would it only fuel the fire? She had grown up in a world where appearances mattered more than truth, where silence was often demanded to avoid scandal. Now, that silence felt like suffocation. Every insult pressed her smaller until it seemed she might vanish into the seat altogether. The fear was real, but beneath it flickered something she didn't yet recognize. Anger. Anger at the cruelty, at the cowardice of strangers, at herself for feeling powerless. Michael's jaw tightened as he watched. He had risen through boardrooms where men doubted him before he spoke, had walked streets where strangers assumed guilt before innocence, had endured slurs that scarred but never broke him. He recognized the look on Claire's face, the look of someone being crushed beneath the weight of prejudice, of someone realizing how isolating it felt when no one else dared to stand beside you. The plane soared higher, but the cabin atmosphere sank lower. Each insult, each smirk, each averted gaze painted a portrait of a world where cruelty reigned and silence obeyed. Claire's heart pounded as though it wanted to escape her chest, and Michael knew the moment of decision had arrived, because there is always a choice in these moments. To remain silent, to allow cruelty to take root, or to rise. And Michael Adebayo had never been the kind of man who stayed seated when injustice stood tall. The moment was building, heavy as thunderclouds. Before a storm, the passengers didn't know it yet, but they were about to witness something they would never forget. The minutes crawled, each one feeding the fire that seemed to burn only hotter in the cabin. Claire tried to bury herself in the safety of silence. But silence was no shield. It only made her a target. The whispers behind her turned into comments tossed like stones, each word intended to bruise, to strip away her composure until nothing remained but humiliation. One of the men leaned forward, his voice deliberately loud enough for several rows to hear. "Look at her sitting there acting like she owns the place. Classic." His laughter was sharp, rehearsed, the kind that drew others into its cruelty. Another joined him. "Bet she's never worked a day in her life. White princess flying, away from her problems." Their cruelty wasn't about truth. It never was. It was about power, about breaking someone down where everyone could watch. And still, no one moved. A woman across the aisle glanced over, her lips parted as if she might speak, but she lowered her eyes quickly, retreating into the false safety of apathy. A businessman nearby adjusted his headphones, pretending he heard nothing. Each silence felt like a betrayal. The insults grew darker, sharper, slipping into tones that left no doubt this wasn't just mockery. It was racism twisted in reverse. Venom poured out under the thin disguise of casual banter. "She thinks the world belongs to her kind. Always taking up space, expecting everyone to bow down." Their words carried the weight of resentment, delivered with the satisfaction of seeing her squirm. Claire's chest heaved with shallow breaths. She tried to focus on the small screen in front of her, the glow of a movie she couldn't even follow, her vision blurred with unshed tears. Her throat ached with the need to respond, but fear bound her like rope. She remembered her father's voice from childhood. Never cause a scene. Never give them a reason to look down on you. But here, staying silent wasn't protecting her dignity. It was surrendering it. Michael's gaze never wavered. He had seen this theater of cruelty too many times. He knew the mechanics. The aggressors grew bolder when unchecked, their words feeding on cowardice around them. They tested boundaries, and if no one pushed back, they turned merciless. He saw the way Claire folded into herself, and he recognized the look, because he had once worn it himself. The turbulence returned, shaking the plane briefly, but even that distraction couldn't stop the momentum of their cruelty. One man chuckled, nudging his companion. "Scared now, princess? Poor little thing. Probably wishes Daddy was here to protect her." The words landed like knives, not just mocking her fear of flying, but reducing her to a caricature of helplessness. Claire's, hands clenched into fists on her lap, her nails digging crescents into her palms. She had never felt so small, so exposed, so utterly powerless. Every second that passed convinced her she was trapped in a nightmare with no escape, that the flight attendants wouldn't help, that the strangers around her had decided she was not worth defending, but at the back of the cabin, something was shifting. Michael adjusted his seatbelt slowly, the quiet rustle barely audible. His mind was calm, but his body tensed with the readiness of a man who had carried himself through boardroom battles, courtrooms, and streets where silence could mean defeat. He knew the cruelty would not stop until someone forced it to stop. And he knew he could not watch another person suffer beneath the same prejudice that had haunted him all his life. The plane soared through the clouds, its destination hours away, but inside the air had grown heavy, suffocating. Every insult, every laugh, every silence was weaving together a moment that could no longer be ignored. Michael's decision was already made. The only question left was how long he would allow the cruelty to continue before he rose to shatter it. The cabin had become a cage of cruelty. Every laugh from the row ahead, every muttered insult, pressed Claire deeper into despair. She stared at the glowing seatbelt sign as though it might deliver her from this nightmare, but no escape came. The voices grew bolder, sharpened by the cowardly comfort of silence all around. "Bet she's never had to fight for a thing in her life," one sneered. "Just sits there, waiting for the world to serve her." Another added, his words dripping contempt. "Pathetic white girl." The final blow came, louder this time, meant for all to hear. The words cracked something inside Claire. Shame and rage collided within her chest, her body trembling with the unbearable weight of humiliation. Her eyes burned, but she refused to let the tears fall. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break. Yet she felt herself unraveling all the same, her silence becoming a prison she could not escape. And then a sound cut through the suffocating air. The firm scrape of a chair pushing back. Michael rose. The movement alone was enough to draw eyes. The aggressors paused, their laughter faltering, as the tall figure from the back began to walk forward. His presence commanded attention without a single word. Broad shoulders squared, gaze steady, each step deliberate. The quiet authority of a man who had fought battles far greater than this filled the narrow aisle. Claire looked up, startled. For the first time since the harassment began, her gaze met someone's who did not look away. His eyes held no pity, no hesitation, only resolve. In that instant, she realized she was no longer alone. Passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, sensing the shift in the air. The whispers stilled. The cabin, once filled with cruel laughter, grew tense with anticipation. It was as if everyone knew something irreversible was about to happen. Michael stopped just beside her row. His presence loomed, calm yet unyielding. His silence louder than any insult that had been spoken. The aggressors, emboldened only by the inaction of others, faltered now beneath the weight of his stare. Their smirks weakened, their confidence wavering. For years, Michael had endured words like theirs, sometimes whispered, sometimes shouted, always cutting. He had borne them in boardrooms, in interviews, in the streets. He had borne them because survival required restraint. But here, watching Claire endure the same poison, he knew silence would make him complicit. And Michael Adebayo had never lived his life in silence. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need theatrics. His stillness was power, his presence resistance. The men shifted in their seats, suddenly exposed beneath the scrutiny of a man who refused to look away. Their cruelty, once fed by laughter and cowardice, began to wither. The passengers watched, breath held. The flight attendants lingered in the galley, nervous, uncertain. No one moved, no one spoke, waiting to see what this confrontation would become. Claire sat frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Relief mixed with disbelief. This stranger, this man, had chosen to rise when no one else would. His courage filled the void where everyone else's silence had crushed her. She could almost breathe again, though fear still coiled tightly in her stomach. The aggressors tried to mask their faltering with forced laughter. "What's your problem?" one muttered, though his voice carried less conviction now. Another shifted in his seat, pretending nonchalance but unable to meet Michael's gaze. The last one looked away entirely. His smirk dissolved. Michael remained still, unflinching. His silence was a mirror, forcing them to confront their own ugliness. He was not simply defending Claire. He was condemning every moment of cruelty that had built to this. He was standing for every silence that had ever enabled hate to thrive. The cabin was no longer theirs. It belonged to him now. And in that moment, at 30,000 feet above the world, a truth became undeniable. Prejudice thrives on silence, but it crumbles before courage. The silence stretched, heavy as steel. For a moment, the men still clung to the brittle bravado that had fed their cruelty. One of them leaned back in his seat, forcing a smirk he no longer felt. "What? You think you're some kind of hero?" His words wavered, more fragile than he intended. Michael didn't flinch. He stood anchored in the aisle, his presence filling the space like a storm gathering strength. Years of endurance had shaped him into a man who knew exactly when to strike, and when to let silence speak louder than words. He didn't need to raise his voice. His authority radiated in the steady weight of his gaze. Passengers shifted restlessly. Some avoided looking at him, guilt crawling up their spines for having done nothing. Others stared openly, their expressions caught between awe and shame. It was as though the entire cabin had awakened, forced to recognize the cruelty they had allowed to fester unchecked. Claire sat rigid in her seat, breath shallow, her body trembling not with fear anymore, but with something else: relief, disbelief, and the fragile beginnings of safety. The man who had risen for her was not just any passenger. His composure, his command, his aura, it all hinted at something far greater than the tailored suit could explain. The aggressors faltered further. One muttered under his breath, "Just sit down, man." Another shifted uncomfortably, tugging at his shirt collar. Their laughter had died, their confidence evaporated. What had once been mockery now looked like fear. And then the inevitable happened. A flight attendant approached, cautious, unsure. Her voice was hushed, her tone nervous. "Sir, is everything all right here?" She looked from Claire, pale and shaking, to the men still slouched in their seats, and finally up at Michael. For a brief moment she seemed to recognize him. Something flickered in her eyes, a spark of familiarity. Michael's response was calm, measured, but it carried the weight of unshakable authority. "Everything will be," he said simply. It was then that recognition spread. A man a few rows down gasped softly, his eyes widening as though he were seeing a ghost. A woman whispered, "Isn't that Michael Adebayo?" The name rippled through, the cabin like electricity, a revelation dawning on the crowd. Some passengers exchanged glances, their earlier silence now steeped in guilt. Others pulled out phones, half hidden, as though needing proof of what their eyes already knew. The aggressors froze. Their smirks collapsed into expressions of pale disbelief. They had not only targeted a vulnerable woman, they had drawn the attention of one of the most powerful men in the world. Michael didn't need to announce his identity. The truth revealed itself through whispers, through the recognition on faces. Around the cabin, through the sudden shift in atmosphere from disdain to reverence. He was not just a black man rising against cruelty. He was a billionaire, a symbol of triumph against a system built to break him, standing as proof that dignity could not be bought, but earned. Claire's chest tightened as she looked up at him, realization dawning in her own mind. The stranger who had risen for her was more than she could have imagined. And yet, in that moment, his wealth, his power, his reputation, none of it mattered. What mattered was the humanity he had shown when no one else had. The men slumped in their seats, unable to meet his gaze. Their bravado had turned to humiliation. Around them, passengers who had once stayed silent now shifted in discomfort, their complicity reflected back at them through Michael's unyielding stance. The confrontation had ended not with shouting, not with violence, but with the quiet, unshakable power of a man who refused to let cruelty rule unchecked. At 30,000 feet, justice had risen, not in the form of punishment, but in the presence of a truth that could no longer be ignored. The weight of recognition swept through the cabin like a tidal wave. Whispers sharpened into gasps, the name Michael Adebayo echoing in hushed tones between rows. Those who had once shrunk into cowardice now leaned forward, their shame growing with every second of realization. They had witnessed cruelty, allowed it to fester, and only now, when power and wealth had revealed themselves, did they stir. Michael's gaze never left the men. His presence, steady as stone, made them wilt where they sat. One shifted uncomfortably, his bravado dissolving into flushed embarrassment. Another fidgeted with the strap of his watch, avoiding every pair of eyes around him. The third stared blankly at the floor, his earlier cruelty crumbling into silence. The audience that had once encouraged them with laughter and apathy was gone. All that remained was exposure. Claire's trembling slowed as she breathed in the air of this new reality. She was no longer the isolated victim, cornered and humiliated. She was the woman who had been defended when no one else dared to move. Relief surged through her, mingled with awe. Her rescuer wasn't just another passenger. He was a man the world revered. Yet he had chosen to intervene not with money, not with power, but with humanity. For years she had lived under her father's lessons: silence, composure, avoidance. But now, at 30,000 feet, she had seen silence broken in the most powerful way imaginable. A stranger had risen not because of what he had, but because of who he was. The flight attendant, still standing nearby, looked torn between duty and admiration. Her lips parted as though she wanted to thank him, but her training restrained her. Instead, she gave a slight nod, retreating back down the aisle with the quiet awareness that she had witnessed something unforgettable. The plane itself seemed to hum differently. The aggressors were no longer predators. They were caged in their shame. The passengers who had once turned away now shifted uncomfortably, their complicity reflected back in every nervous glance. None of them could undo their silence, but none would forget the weight of it either. Michael finally moved, not toward the men, but back toward Claire. His hand rested briefly on the edge of her seat, steadying her in a way no words could. She met his eyes, and in that fleeting moment, everything became clear. Courage is not measured by wealth nor by power, but by the willingness to rise when others stay seated. The storm had broken. The harassment was over. But the impact of what had unfolded would remain etched in every witness's memory long after the wheels of the plane touched the ground. At 30,000 feet, where cruelty thought it had free rein, dignity had stood. Tall, and prejudice had fallen silent. When the plane finally steadied into its long cruise, the air inside the cabin carried a different weight. Gone were the smirks, the jeering laughter, the cruel whispers that had once poisoned the space. What remained was silence, an uneasy, heavy silence that wrapped itself around every passenger like an unwelcome mirror. Claire sat rigid, her body still trembling with the echo of what had just happened. She felt exposed, fragile, yet also held by a strange new strength she hadn't known existed within her. Her life had taught her to avoid confrontation, to bow her head, to remain quiet when cruelty reared its face. But she had just witnessed a truth that shattered everything she had been raised to believe. Silence is not dignity. It is surrender. And sometimes dignity is found in the courage of others when your own has been stripped away. Her eyes flicked toward Michael, who had returned calmly to his seat as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. He leaned back, hands folded neatly, eyes once again on the glowing tablet before him. To anyone who didn't know, he might have looked like just another passenger, lost in business reports. Yet everyone who had seen what he had done knew better. He wasn't just a man in a tailored suit. He was the presence that had forced cruelty into silence. The whispers about his identity grew louder now, but they carried a different tone, no longer contemptuous, but reverent. "That's him, isn't it? The billionaire? I read about him last month." The same mouths that had stayed shut during Claire's humiliation now found their voices in hushed awe. It disgusted her, even as it comforted her. Why? Did it take wealth, fame, and power to make people see him? Why hadn't his humanity been enough? She realized with a shiver that this was the very reality he must live with every day. Not just prejudice, but the knowledge that for many, his worth was only recognized through his fortune and status. Yet in the moment that had mattered most, he had not stood as a billionaire. He had stood as a man who refused to let cruelty triumph. Hours stretched into eternity as the plane carved its way across the sky. Claire tried to close her eyes, but the scene replayed itself behind her eyelids again and again. The laughter, the insults, the unbearable silence of strangers, and then the scrape of his chair as he rose. It played like a memory etched into her soul, one she would never escape and never wish to. When the wheels touched down, the cabin erupted into motion. Passengers reached for bags, fastened coats, checked phones as though the world outside demanded urgency. Yet beneath the flurry of routine, unease lingered. The men who had harassed her avoided every glance, their humiliation a shadow they could not shake. Others stole looks at Claire, guilt flickering in their eyes but never blossoming into apology. Michael moved with quiet efficiency, retrieving his single bag from the overhead compartment. His movements were calm, unhurried, as though he carried no weight at all. But Claire knew better. She knew he carried more than anyone else could understand. She rose too, her legs shaky but resolute. She did not speak. She couldn't, not yet. But she followed him down the narrow aisle, each step a reminder of the moment her world had shifted. At the gate, the crowd dispersed into the chaos of arrivals. Families reunited, businessmen hurried to cars, tourists searched for taxis. Yet the memory of the flight lingered in every one of them, unspoken but unforgettable. They had all been part of something, and whether they had acted or stayed silent, they would carry it with them. For Claire, the impact was deeper still. She had boarded the plane a girl bound by fear and silence, and she stepped off it a woman who had seen courage embodied before her eyes. The image of Michael standing, steady and unyielding, would live inside her forever as a reminder of what it meant to resist hate. Michael, too, walked into the terminal with a calm expression. But inside, the flight had stirred old wounds. He had risen because he could not allow cruelty to reign unchecked. Not again, not in his presence. Yet each time he did, it reminded him of every moment in his own life where no one had risen for him. His wealth, his power, his empire. None of it erased the scars. But perhaps, in standing for someone else, he had lessened the weight of her scars before they could form. The crowd soon swallowed them both, but the story of that flight did not end in the terminal. It lived on in the minds of those who had watched, in the hearts of those who had been shamed into silence, and most of all in the soul of the young woman who had been saved. Claire would never forget that at 30,000 feet she had been humiliated, abandoned, and nearly broken. But she would also never forget that at that same height, She had witnessed the quiet, unshakable strength of a man who proved that love for humanity is stronger than hate, that dignity can be defended, and that silence can and must be broken, because sometimes the greatest lesson comes not from the cruelty of others, but from the courage of one who refuses to sit down. And so the question lingers for everyone who reads or hears of what happened that day. If cruelty rose in front of you, would you stay seated or would you stand? Outside the terminal, the world bustled on as if nothing remarkable had occurred. Travelers hurried toward waiting cars, screens flashed with departure times, and announcements echoed over the intercom. Life went on, indifferent to the storm that had broken in the sky above. Yet for those who had been on that flight, something had shifted forever. Claire stepped into the cool air of the arrivals hall, the weight of her carry-on light compared to the heaviness in her chest. She moved through the crowd, but her mind replayed the journey over and over. She could still hear the venom in those voices, still feel the sting of humiliation pressing down on her shoulders. But stronger than that was the memory of the scrape, of his chair, the moment Michael had stood. That sound, simple yet decisive, had become the turning point of her story. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant for someone to rise for her, not because of family, not out of obligation, but simply because it was right. It pierced through the emptiness her upbringing had instilled in her, the cold reminders to stay silent, to avoid confrontation, to preserve reputation above dignity. Michael's courage had shown her something her family never had. That silence only protects cruelty, and dignity is defended through action. She paused near the terminal doors, watching as Michael walked with his quiet confidence, a small bag slung over his shoulder, no entourage, no announcement of who he was. He moved like any other man, though she knew the truth, that he was someone extraordinary, not because of his wealth, not because of his fame, but because he had chosen to stand when no one else had. Michael felt the eyes on him. He always did. Fame was both a crown and a burden. Recognition followed him even when he craved anonymity. Yet tonight, what lingered in his mind wasn't the whispers of his name in the cabin or the hushed reverence of strangers. What lingered was the look in Claire's eyes as he stood for her. A look he knew too well, fear dissolving into relief, despair transforming into fragile trust. For years he had carried scars carved by silence, classrooms where teachers ignored, slurs, meetings where colleagues dismissed him, streets where strangers judged him before he spoke. Each moment had been another weight pressing on his shoulders, another reminder that society measured him by the color of his skin before anything else. Rising against cruelty had become second nature to him, a duty born not out of choice but survival. Yet this time had been different. This time he hadn't risen for himself. He had risen for her. And though he had done it instinctively, he realized now how much it mattered. To her, yes, but also to him. For perhaps it proved that the scars he carried could become shields for someone else. Claire hesitated at the doorway, watching him disappear into the stream of travelers. Part of her wanted to run after him, to thank him, to tell him how deeply he had changed her. But another part knew that words would fall short. Some acts of courage could never be repaid. They could only be remembered and honored through how one chose to live afterward. She inhaled deeply, the cool air filling her lungs with a strange sense of renewal. The humiliation she had endured would never vanish, but neither would the lesson she had learned. She would no longer bow to silence. She would no longer hide behind the comfort of composure. The world might still try to shame her, to break her, but she had seen what courage looked like, and she would carry it with her. For Michael, the night ended the way so many of his nights did, alone, moving through the world with quiet strength. Yet this time, as he settled into the back of a waiting car, he allowed himself a small breath of peace. He had not changed the world that night. He had not dismantled the prejudice that haunted him, or stopped the cruelty that thrived in silence. But for one woman, in one moment, he had made a difference. And sometimes, he thought, that was enough. The city lights blurred past the car window as he disappeared into the night. Behind him, in the airport, Claire lingered with her heart heavier and lighter all at once. Both knew their paths had crossed for a reason neither could yet name. Both carried wounds, but both also carried strength. And in that shared experience, even as they walked separate ways, something had been forged. The truth that love for humanity, courage in the face of hate, and dignity defended at all costs will always rise higher than prejudice, because when one man stands, he lifts more than himself. He lifts the world around him.